Captain's log, stardate. Well, nobody really cared about dates anymore. The universe was collapsing at an alarming rate. Specifically, suns were disappearing. Imagine the cosmic equivalent of someone walking into your house and sneakily stealing all your light bulbs, but leaving the furniture. No black holes, no supernovas, just poof, gone. And if you're thinking this sounds like an intergalactic plumbing issue, well, you'd be right. It was all very inconvenient. Enter the crew of the SS Fixer-Upper, a ship packed with the most brilliant, or at least available, minds from across the galaxy. Their mission? To stop whatever cosmic plumber was bungling the universe's light fixtures. Among them, of course, was one very nerdy and very oblivious human. His name was Greg, just Greg. He was not a captain, not a commander, not even a lieutenant. He was officially a quantum data specialist, which was fancy talk for the guy who spends all his time staring at numbers nobody else cares about. Greg had the kind of face that you immediately forgot and a demeanor that made you wonder if he was part of the furniture. He was the kind of human who could disappear from a room without ever actually leaving it. Greg was also entirely, hopelessly oblivious to the fact that his alien co-worker Zilara had been attempting to seduce him for approximately the last 47 star cycles. Zilara, for the record, was a Thalaxian, a species known for their telepathic abilities, their 4 arms, and their general impatience with slower, less perceptive species. Humans, for example. Zilara found Greg fascinating, in the same way one might find an ancient puzzle fascinating, frustrating, incomprehensible, but somehow irresistible. She'd dropped hints, many hints, hints that were less subtle and more like interstellar billboards flashing, "Notice me!" But Greg, being Greg, noticed only one thing: numbers, glorious, sparkling numbers. On this particular day, Greg was hunched over his console, muttering to himself about quasi-drift velocities, when Zilara decided enough was enough. She was a Thalaxian for stars' sake, and Thalaxians did not wait around for things to happen. They made things happen. With all 4 arms crossed, she stormed over to Greg's workstation. "Greg," she said, her voice a mix of sultry and slightly exasperated. He didn't look up. "Yes, Zilara. We need to talk." "Sure, but could it wait? I think I'm onto something with the sun dissipation algorithm. If I can just—" Zilara's patience hit its limit. She unfurled 2 of her arms and with lightning speed slapped the console shut. Greg blinked up at her, bewildered. "Hey, I was working on that." "Yes, and I'm working on this," she snapped, gesturing rather dramatically to the space between them. "For the love of the cosmos, Greg, are you completely oblivious?" Greg blinked again, mentally replaying the last 47 star cycles to see if he had missed a memo. Oblivious to what? Zilara sighed and resisted the urge to telepathically strangle him. "Let's skip the subtlety, because apparently that's a language you don't speak. I like you, Greg." Greg's face lit up. "Oh, well, that's good. I like you too. You're a great co-worker, very efficient with the data processing." Zilara groaned inwardly. She had seduced intergalactic diplomats with a single glance. She had once brought an entire species to its knees, metaphorically speaking, with nothing but a well-timed smile. And yet here she was, completely flummoxed by one very dense human. The SS Fixer-Upper was a ship full of aliens, each more bizarre than the last. There were the gelatinous blobs from Glucon 7, who communicated through interpretive dance. The Lugari, whose heads resembled giant asparagus stalks, and who were perpetually offended at the existence of anything with less than 4 legs. And, of course, the sentient AI, who ran the ship's cafeteria, which had developed a fondness for serving meals that were more conceptual art than actual food. But none of this concerned Greg. He was, as usual, oblivious to the chaos around him. So when Zilara, in a final act of desperation, invited him to her quarters, he just assumed it was for more work-related discussions. Zilara's quarters were sleek, futuristic, and filled with objects that were, to Greg, entirely incomprehensible. The walls shimmered with strange pulsating light patterns, and the furniture looked as though it had been designed by someone who had never seen a chair, but had heard a sketchy description of one. There were strange artifacts on display, glowing spheres, floating crystals, and what appeared to be a small creature trapped in a jar, playing a mournful tune on a tiny violin. Greg, of course, noticed none of this. He was too busy being fascinated by the small holographic star chart hovering above Zilara's bed. "I've been running some numbers," he said, stepping closer to the chart. "If we adjust the trajectory of the ship by 0.002 degrees, we might be able to catch a gravitational anomaly that—" Zilara let out a very unthalaxian groan of frustration. She had brought him here, to her private quarters, and he was talking about anomalies. This was not how things were supposed to go. She had imagined this moment differently, something involving a slow build of tension, a passionate exchange of words, and perhaps some light telepathic bonding. Instead, she was watching Greg admire a star chart, like it was the most interesting thing in the universe. "Greg," she said, cutting him off, "we're not here to talk about gravitational anomalies." "We're not?" Greg blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Then, what are we here for?" Zilara closed her eyes briefly, collecting herself. She had been patient with him. She had tried subtlety. She had tried directness. It was time to resort to the one tactic she hadn't yet considered, appealing to Greg's inner nerd. She turned to him, her forearms resting strategically at her sides. "Greg," she said, her tone suddenly soft and conspiratorial, "do you like games?" Greg's eyes lit up. "Games? I love games. Strategy games, puzzle games, RPGs, you name it. I've beaten every version of Galactic Conquest on ultra-hard mode, and I've maxed out my score on Astrobits." Zilara smiled. Finally, she had found the key to unlocking Greg's attention. "Well," she said, leaning in just enough to make him pay attention, "I have a game for you. A special game, with points and everything." Greg's interest was piqued. "Points? How many?" "Oh, plenty of points," she said, her voice silky. "And the winner—" She paused for effect, letting her words hang in the air. "Gets a prize." Greg's eyes widened. "A prize? What kind of prize?" Zilara smiled, a slow, knowing smile. "Let's just say it's something special." Greg was hooked. He loved games. He loved winning. He loved points. This was his wheelhouse. "Okay," he said. "I'm in. What's the game?" Zilara gestured toward the bed, where the holographic star chart was still hovering. With a flick of her hand, the chart disappeared, and the bed suddenly seemed much more inviting. "It's simple," she said, her voice taking on a playful tone. "I hide. You find. The trick is, you can only use your fingers, and the more you find, the more points you get." Greg blinked, trying to process this. "Wait, hide and seek? In the bed? And I can only use my fingers?" Zilara nodded, her patience wearing thin but still holding on. "Exactly. Think of it like a tactile puzzle. You like puzzles, don't you?" Greg thought about it for a moment. He did like puzzles, and if this was some kind of advanced alien game, well, it was probably more complex than it sounded. Maybe it involved some sort of multi-dimensional mechanics or quantum entanglement. That would explain why Zilara had to be in the bed too. It was probably a cooperative game. He shrugged. "All right, I'm game. How do we start?" Zilara resisted the urge to slap her forehead. "Just get in the bed, Greg." The bed was surprisingly comfortable, despite looking like it had been designed by a committee of species who had never actually experienced sleep. Greg sat awkwardly on one side, while Zilara positioned herself on the other, her forearms draped elegantly over the sheets, her eyes fixed on him. "Okay," she said, her voice dripping with forced patience. "I'm going to hide certain objects. You have to find them using only your fingers. Every time you find something, you get a point." Greg nodded, still thinking this was some sort of advanced alien game. perhaps involving hidden quantum data packets or microscopic sensors embedded in the bed. His mind raced with the possibilities. Maybe this was one of those Thalaxian brain training exercises he'd heard about, the kind that could enhance cognitive functions. Or maybe it was a tactile strategy game that required a delicate balance of hand-eye coordination and problem-solving. He cracked his knuckles. He was ready. Zilara, for her part, was beginning to wonder if this had been a terrible idea. She had seduced alien diplomats, outsmarted warlords, and negotiated peace treaties under far more complicated circumstances. But seducing Greg, this was starting to feel like her greatest challenge yet. "All right," she said, positioning herself under the covers. "I'm going to hide now." Greg watched her slide under the sheets, his brain still whirring with theories. "So, what exactly am I supposed to find? Are they like energy crystals or something? You know, like in Galactic Conquest when you have to go around the map and—" "No," Zilara interrupted, trying to keep her voice steady. "No energy crystals, just me." Greg frowned. "You?" "Yes, Greg, me." Zilara's voice was now a mixture of exasperation and desperation. "I'm the object you're trying to find, using your fingers. Only your fingers." Greg blinked. "Oh, right, got it." He paused, still confused. "But why are you hiding if I'm going to find you anyway?" Zilara closed her eyes briefly and took a deep breath. She had to remind herself that Greg was not like the others. He required a different approach. "It's part of the game, Greg. The challenge is in the finding." "Oh," Greg said, finally seeming to understand. "So it's like a skill-based puzzle where I have to find the optimal solution to locate you. Got it. This is going to be fun." Zilara suppressed a groan. "Yes, Greg, fun. Let's start." Greg leaned forward hesitantly, his fingers hovering just above the covers. "Okay, here I go." He started with what could only be described as the least seductive finger movements in the history of the universe. Tentatively, his fingertips brushed the edge of the blanket, as if afraid that pressing too hard would set off some sort of alien alarm. He moved with the caution of a man defusing a bomb, his fingers creeping inch by inch across the sheets. Zilara watched from beneath the covers, feeling both ridiculous and strangely amused. She had expected frustration, but watching Greg's utterly clueless approach was, in its own way, charming. He wasn't trying to be difficult. He truly was this dense. Somehow, that made things a little more bearable. Greg, meanwhile, was deep in concentration. His fingers tapped gently against the fabric, moving with the precision of a man who had spent far too much time mastering the fine motor controls needed to operate 10 different types of gaming controllers. He was about halfway down the bed when he paused, looking up at Zilara with a frown. "Wait," he said, "are there any bonus points for speed, or is it more about accuracy?" Zilara blinked. "What? Like, am I supposed to find you as fast as possible, or should I be more careful and methodical? Because I've noticed in some games, if you rush too much, you miss crucial details, but if you take your time, you get a higher score." Zilara stared at him, momentarily speechless. "Greg, just find me." Greg nodded, his face serious. "Right, got it, no rushing." He continued his painstaking search, his fingers moving with the efficiency of a man who believed this was the most important task he had ever undertaken. Zilara, hidden under the covers, found herself torn between laughing and screaming. She had never encountered a being so oblivious to her intentions, and yet there was something endearing about his total commitment to the game. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Greg's fingers brushed against something warm and soft. He paused, his face lighting up in triumph. "I found you!" he exclaimed, grinning like he'd just unlocked a secret level in his favorite game. Zilara poked her head out from under the covers, her expression a mixture of disbelief and something close to amusement. "Yes, Greg, you found me." Greg looked positively delighted with himself. "How many points do I get?" Zilara stared at him for a long moment, her frustration melting away into something else, something she hadn't expected. He was hopeless, yes, but he was also genuinely sweet and, in his own way, trying very hard to engage with her. Zilara stared at him for a long moment, her frustration melting into something that was almost affection. He was hopeless, but in a sweet, endearing way. The kind of hopelessness that made you want to either shake him or hug him, or possibly both, simultaneously. Maybe she had been approaching this all wrong. Maybe she had to appeal to Greg not as a human, but as the obsessive, nerdy puzzle solver he was. "Well," Zilara said, her voice softening a bit, "you get 10 points for finding me." Greg's eyes lit up like a kid who had just unlocked an Easter egg in a video game. 10 points? That's great! What's the next level? Zilara blinked. Next level? She hadn't exactly planned for a multi-level game of seduce the clueless human, but she could roll with it. The next level is more challenging." "I love a challenge," Greg said, his enthusiasm boundless. "What do I have to do?" Zilara sighed inwardly. She had tried everything, subtlety, directness, even a literal game of hide and seek, and Greg was still oblivious. She realized then that the only way to get through to him was to speak his language, the language of a nerd. He wasn't going to respond to traditional flirting or romantic advances, but there was one thing she hadn't tried yet: a boss battle. "All right, Greg," she said, getting out of the bed and standing tall, her forearms spread out in a dramatic pose. "The next level is the final boss." Greg's eyes widened, his excitement palpable. "A final boss? Already?" He sat up straighter, his entire body tensed with anticipation. "What's the boss called? Does it have special attacks? What's its health bar like?" Zilara smirked, realizing she finally had his full attention. "The boss is called the Thalaxian Temptress." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a low, sultry tone. "And her special attack is seduction." Greg's face scrunched up in concentration, as if trying to figure out the optimal strategy for this new challenge. "Seduction, huh? Sounds tricky. What's my objective?" Zilara resisted the urge to facepalm. "Your objective," she said, her voice dripping with amusement, "is to defeat the Temptress by, successfully responding to her advances. But beware, Greg, the Temptress is known for her patience and cunning. She won't go down easily." Greg nodded, completely serious. "Right, I'll need to use all my skills for this one. What's the best approach? Should I focus on defense, or is this more of an aggressive strategy situation? Maybe a combo attack?" Zilara could barely keep a straight face. "I'd say it's more of an interactive strategy. You have to engage with the Temptress on a personal level. Maybe try complimenting her, or showing her that you're emotionally available." Greg looked confused. "Emotional availability, that's a rare skill drop. I haven't maxed that out yet, but I can try." Zilara bit her lip. This was both the most absurd and strangely endearing seduction attempt she'd ever experienced. She leaned in closer, her face inches from his. "The Temptress is closing in, Greg. What will you do?" Greg's brow furrowed as he thought hard. His mind raced through possible strategies, calculating the best approach. Then, with a deep breath, he blurted out, "You've got really nice eyes." Zilara blinked, momentarily caught off guard. It wasn't exactly the declaration of love she'd been hoping for, but it was something. "That's a good start." Greg, buoyed by what he perceived as success, continued. "And, your tentacles, no, I mean arms. Your multiple arms are very symmetrical." Zilara raised an eyebrow. "Symmetrical?" Greg nodded eagerly. "Yeah, symmetry is a sign of evolutionary fitness in many species. You're very fit." Zilara couldn't help it. She burst out laughing. It wasn't the sultry, seductive laugh she had been aiming for, but a genuine, full-throated laugh. Greg, for all his awkwardness and obliviousness, was trying so hard in his own nerdy way. She found herself genuinely enjoying the ridiculousness of the whole situation. Greg, for his part, looked confused but pleased. "Is that good? Did I win?" Zilara wiped a tear from her eye, still laughing. "You know what, Greg? You did win." Greg's face lit up. "Really? I defeated the final boss." And before things could get any more off topic, the ship's alarms bellowed like old dusty bagpipes, jolting them out of the so-called romance of the Dungeons and Dragons type game, which seemed to be working in Zilara's favor.